Yeah. All right, so the next slide. Why do we track tree canopy cover? Like I've said, it's a citywide metric for environmental health. It's really the only number that the city has to answer the question, or to even get near the question of what's the environmental health of the city? What's the ecological health in Portland? How are we doing towards that? So for that reason, canopy cover is mentioned in numerous citywide plans, and we have citywide goals attached. And it's Portland Parks and Recreation's responsibility to track progress towards that goal. So our goal currently, if you didn't know, is to cover 1/3 of the city, have it under the shade of trees and tree canopy cover by 2035. And that goal is in the comprehensive plan. It's also mentioned in the climate action plan. So that's a citywide goal. Like I've said, we care about where that 1/3 of the city, how you make up that 1/3 pie slice of the city who's getting the services of those trees. And the climate action plan goes a little bit further in telling us that I believe residential neighborhoods should all have a minimum of 25% canopy cover. And that's getting towards that idea that we shouldn't get all of our 1/3 of the city covered by trees on the west side, for instance, right? Of course, we don't want that.
I want only that.
Only that. We want everyone to have these services. And when you look at, okay, we want to cover this much of the city in under tree canopy cover, we only have 12 more years to get there. One basic question you ask is, well, how much space is there for tree planting? And that's something that our team has worked on in the past. About 5 years ago, we put out a report showing the reasonable available space for tree planting could get us up, in addition to what we already have, up to about 52% canopy cover. So we have room for trees. Portland has a lot of, we're not, despite what we think of ourselves, we're not an especially dense city by North American standards, and we do have a lot of room still for trees. And I can talk a little bit about some of the cities we compare ourselves to. Well, we think we're turning into, San Francisco or something. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is probably a better comparison. They have a slightly higher population density, so they're fitting more people into the same amount of space. And they currently have over 40% canopy cover. They have a goal of 60% canopy cover. Whereas New York City obviously fits millions more people into the same space as Portland. New York City manages to have about the same canopy cover as Portland east of the Willamette River. And you may have heard us say that before. It's a statistic that not a lot of people believe. They're like, how can that be? But we really do have a lot of space, a lot of room for trees, especially on the east side of Portland, where 80% of our population lives. So that's at about a little over 20% canopy cover east of the Willamette River. And I'll show you some maps, of course, as we go on here. We all know about, just in our experience in our town, that there are areas of the city that are well canopied, and there are areas that are being less served by the urban forest. And part of the reason why we track where canopy is and where it could be is that it allows us to see how these services are going to be distributed across the city, who's being served. And Portland is not unique in that our canopy is not equitably distributed. But we certainly suffer from some of these inequities. And yes, that is 82nd Avenue. I put it there on purpose because it is a focus of the city right now. wouldn't it be nice to have a nice wide median with large form trees in the middle of that? Right now, 82nd Avenue serves as a very hot, gash across the east side that is really meant to move cars and not as a space for people. So if you're a pedestrian, there's some pedestrians in each of these pictures. Obviously, which bus stop do you want to be waiting at for your bus? Probably the one on the left. Okay, so I'm going to show you. Are you going to do this?
Sharing, yeah. So
okay,
I'll stop sharing, then you can throw yours up there.
All right. This might take me a second. I want to show you a sneak preview of something my team has been working on, mapping out canopy cover across the city. So,
As opposed to our previous maps of canopy.
this is new. We have new information that just came out in the past few months. One of the sources for telling us how much canopy cover there is in the city comes from Portland Metro. The Metro regional government creates a map of canopy about every 5 years, and they recently released some new data, and I just want to show it to you. This is the part of every meeting where someone struggles with technology. So share screen, there we go. And
Is this LiDAR data or is this gathered another way?
I'll tell you about it in a second.
Okay, sorry.
Don't know what you see.
We're seeing the PowerPoint right now.
All right, and now we're going to go into this. Does everybody see a website, or are you still seeing my presentation?
We're seeing the presentation right now.
Oh, no.
There you go.
There you go. Thanks for your patience. This is a sneak peek of a tool we're going to have up on our website in the next month or so. But like I said, Portland Metro recently released a map of canopy. That's one of our sources. We have other studies that tell us how much canopy is in the city and whether or not it's growing or declining, but this is one of them. And Bruce asked whether or not it is coming from LiDAR data. Yes, LiDAR. I don't really want to explain what LiDAR is. It's a plane flies over and shoots millions of lasers at Portland, and they can create basically a 3D model of our tree canopy. And they do this every 5 years, and that is going into this. It does help with measuring the extent of canopy cover too. It's not the only thing they use, but it was used in this. So I'm just going to go down, show you some maps. So this is what it looks pretty green from way above, but I want to show you. That's not a very useful map. I want to show you kind of how canopy is distributed. We look at canopy at a number of different scales. We look at it in parks because we are the Parks Bureau. We work a lot in parks, and we want to know where. That's one of the first places we can have a real impact on tree canopy. So if there are parks that are not being served by trees and that do have a lot of space for trees, we do try to identify those. So for instance, Mount Tabor Park has 62% tree canopy cover. We know that in the developed areas of Mount Tabor Park is where there's more potential, and we can actually map out that it's really only about 40% in the developed areas. So there's a lot of room even at Mount Tabor Park, and I think that's a park I always use because one, it's one that a lot of people are familiar with, and two, oh well, it's a spoiler. It's going to come up again later in my presentation, but this amount of area is the amount of area of canopy that we think we may have lost in the past few years. So,
What was number 2?
that was it. That was, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself as I always do. Here's how canopy is distributed across the city in terms of neighborhoods. This shouldn't be very surprising that those darkest green areas And I'm looking at the map on the right. Those darkest green areas have more canopy. So of course, areas of the west side, Forest Park, obviously, but then also certain neighborhoods on the east side, and especially places with significant natural areas. So where the buttes are, especially in East Portland, there's a little bit more canopy cover coming from those natural areas. They might not necessarily be where people in people's neighborhoods. So even if there are higher canopy numbers in those areas, then people might still not be being served by it. So you can see in Powellhurst Gilbert, for instance, we have 25% canopy cover. Most of the rest of the east side is below that number, so it is pretty low. On the left here, one way we track, using these maps, we can track whether canopy has gained or declined. So purple areas are where Metro is estimating that we've seen declines from 2014 to 2019. It's an interesting distribution. We're the lightest purple area, the brightest purple areas are the ones that have seen the most relative decline. So you're seeing some of the west side have some decline, but remember they still have quite high canopy cover, especially compared to the east side neighbors. In East Portland as well, we're seeing a lot of decline, pretty widespread in East Portland, and that places with less canopy seeing more relative decline. That's something that we're really interested in addressing through our programs. And we can look at canopy across many different scales, and I'm not going to go through everything, but you can see looking at Portland sextants or neighborhood coalitions, we have all this information available to us, and it's going to be available to the public in just a few weeks. And this is these maps, west or east of the Willamette, are especially they're a bright red light, dramatic, yeah. That we have 22% canopy cover east of the Willamette, 56% west of the Willamette. Then everybody always asks, but what about Forest Park? That doesn't count, right? So even without Forest Park, it's still about 45, 46% canopy cover on this side. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and go back to the presentation, Brian.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope that was interesting to folks. If we can go. If we could go to the graph. Yeah, one more. Thank you. So I showed you how Metro has been, there's tracking change in canopy from 2014 to 2019, but we can go a lot further back using different studies, people who have looked at this question in the past. So across all the people who've looked at this from about 1972 to 2015, Portland, the consensus is that there was significant widespread canopy gain from about 25% overall to around 30%, which is quite a lot of progress towards a goal of 33%, 33.3%. And also it was unique among cities. Not many cities over this time period could say that their canopy was growing, especially in this century, in the first years of the 21st century. But as you can see on the graph, the consensus seems to be that we've either plateaued or that we are in decline. So we released a report last year tracking canopy where we're estimating that it's down from about 31% to about 30%, so 29.8%. That sounds like a small loss. The loss was seen across all zoning types, but it was 823 acres. And so my spoiler earlier, that's the size of Mount Tabor every year of those 5 years being lost in tree canopy. So it's pretty significant when you think of it that way. And other studies have backed us up since we released that report. The former chair of the Urban Forestry Commission, Vivek Chandas, his lab has estimated losses, overall net losses over that same time period, and now Metro as well is agreeing with us. So it seems that we have hit a plateau, or we are on the way down, and that has some implications for how we go forward. Looking at, I love every tree person. I swear all my coworkers are also historians, because trees really, it is a history, a living history, like written on the land. So I love the website Vintage Portland. There's always great pictures of the city back in the day. And what I noticed in every one of those pictures, it seems, is that there were no trees. So it's not surprising that we grew from the 70s up until about 2015, because there, even with development, there was a lot of tree planting that happened during that time. And even in the densest areas of the city, we saw canopy gain. The picture on the right there from 2019, it's not especially shady. It still looks like a pretty hot corner, but compared to what it was in 1977, it's significant. And what I like about this picture too is that we put in a light rail line in that time going down Morrison. We obviously developed those blocks around there. This is downtown 2nd and Morrison. And even with all that development, tree canopy we can build tree canopy with development. And I think that's something a lot of tree advocates in the city miss sometimes, is that development can mean canopy gains. It can be a benefit to the urban forests as well, if done right. But since we're estimating that canopy is in decline, there are some things to think about. The period over which we're seeing decline, 2015 to 2020, that was right when Title 11 came into effect, was January 1st, 2015. So regulations drastically improved. Protection for trees and requirements to plant trees drastically improved with that new tree code. And despite that, we still saw losses, or at least our gains stopped. And with canopy loss, I think we're really interested in how those are affecting different areas of the city differently. So losses in high canopy areas are mitigated by gains. What I mean by that is that in our study, what we looked at where gains were coming from, it was, I don't think there was one example where we planted a tree in the past few years and then we were seeing gain from that. Most of the gains we saw were from existing mature trees growing into space. And so if you are a high canopy area with large trees, you're a little bit insulated from loss in that way, that your existing canopy can mitigate the losses, any losses you see, a lot faster than it can by a group like my colleagues who plant trees coming in and planting a lot of street trees in your neighborhood. You're not going to see those gains for a while. And in that sense, canopy loss is always going to accelerate inequality pretty much, unless if you have canopy loss spread across the city, but places with canopy can replace it a lot faster than places without canopy, inequality is going to increase. And that's obviously not an outcome we want to see. So that's overall canopy cover. If we zoom in a little bit, another part of my group's work is to characterize what that canopy is made of. So what makes up the forest? I just want to go real quickly through a few of our programs. We do a lot of tree inventory. Some of you may have joined us. That's popular public program that we run. We're going to be having some events later this summer, inviting the public to come inventory street trees with us. Currently, our street tree inventory, we're in the midst of an update. We did the first round of tree inventory. We inventoried every street tree in the city. It was about 218,000 trees. We finished in 2016, and last year we started up again, and we're trying to finish by next year. We're estimating that we are gaining in terms of stems. We are seeing just in the 1 year plus of inventory we've done to update this inventory, we've seen gains. So we're up to about 225,000 trees. We estimate that it might be up around 250 by the end of it. Species diversity, when we talk about what makes up the forest, so good, more stems is a good thing, but what are those stems? Are they stems that are going to grow? Are they stems that are going to die or be very vulnerable to new threats, whether they be pests or climate? So one thing we're really interested in is species diversity. Urban forestry as a discipline, at least in modern times, really was born out of the mistakes of planting the same tree over and over, the same species of tree across entire cities, and watching pests or pathogens take those out and having just catastrophic effects for cities. Modern urban forest management is laser focused on tree diversity as a way to be less vulnerable to those things. So our species diversity of our street trees, maples still make up just under a quarter of all street trees, which is more than we'd like, because maples are especially vulnerable to a number of pests, but especially to Asian longhorn beetle, something that has popped up. It's an exotic insect that maple is their favorite food. And it has popped up in New York and Chicago and Ohio. And it would be just to a street tree population, but also to our natural areas with our big leaf maples and pine maples. They make up a significant portion of our natural areas as well. So it would be bad if it came. So we want to limit that number. And then the rose family as well. So the rose family, think all those pretty flowering trees. You go out on a sunny day in March or April, and you see white and pink everywhere. Those are basically all members of the rose family: plums, cherries, pears, apples, all those beautiful trees that generally are smaller stature and shorter lived. And so when you think from an urban forest management perspective, we want trees that live long and grow large. The rose family doesn't really check those boxes for us. So we don't want too many of our eggs in that basket either. And so between those two groups, it's nearly half of our street trees. And so that's why urban forestry, in our role as regulating street trees in the city, really focus on our approved street tree lists on species diversity and getting really hardy trees that are going to survive and thrive long term. Other things we know from the street tree inventory: unequal distribution. Just like in our canopy, some neighborhoods have more street trees, have a higher stocking level, so more of their empty spaces are filled with tree than others. And then there's a lot of missed opportunities, a lot of space for planting trees across the city, thousands and thousands of vacant spaces for street tree plantings across the city. We've also inventoried all the trees in our developed parks. So your neighborhood parks, the park you go to throw a Frisbee around or go to the splash pad on a hot day. We inventoried about 25,000 trees across our neighborhood parks. And again, we saw unequal distribution. Some of our parks, especially our newer parks, have less canopy cover. That has to do with the historic land use, usually that was happening there. And some of our older parks are really well canopied, but all the trees are pretty much the same age because they were all planted at the same time. So we talk about even age stands, stand of trees all being the same age. If they all age out at the same time, that could be a lot of work for my arborist colleagues to clean up, and it could be a big period of time where there's a lot less canopy services getting to the neighborhood from that park. Our park trees population is a little bit less diverse, but that's actually a good thing, because they can really hold a lot of trees that in our smaller backyards and in our street tree spaces we can't support. So Douglas fir is a hard thing to grow in if you have a small yard, and especially along a street. There aren't many areas of the right of way where you can grow a Doug fir, but our parks do a great job of growing species like that. So especially native species. So we're pretty happy with the species diversity in our parks. And also the condition of our trees and parks is mostly pretty good. 94% were in good or fair condition. So that gives us a head start when we start our proactive pruning program that I'm sure you've been briefed on, where we're going into parks and maintaining these trees, sometimes for the first time in decades, going through systematically through the parks. Most of them are in pretty good condition. We're starting from a good place. And just maybe one or two more slides, and then I'll have some time for questions. One other inventory we partnered with the US Forest Service a few years ago on the Urban Forest Inventory Analysis Program. This is bringing their, they have done research out there in the forests for years, and they have ways of measuring tree canopy and answering questions about what makes up the species diversity of the forest and some of the structural characteristics of it, how large the trees are, et cetera. And they brought those to cities just in the past few years, and we were one of the first adopters to that. That information is public. It's on the web if you look up the My Cities Trees app. And there's a little screenshot from it there on the slide. You can look around and see what they found. And what's good about this information is my team can inventory all the street trees in the city. We can inventory all the park trees we want, but it's hard to get a real idea of what's happening on private land. And that's one value of this study. So it can tell you what's happening on private land. And it's a resource worth $6 billion. So it also gave us a value for the forest. Just real quickly, how we use this info. Like I said at the beginning, our work really feeds into a lot of the work of my colleagues. So we can prioritize where we spend those limited dollars and that limited staff time on planting trees. So we have a priority planting areas that we've identified, and that's something we update every 3 years based on the canopy cover of those neighborhoods, as well as some demographic variables. I mentioned the approved tree lists. That's we monitor the trees we plant to see how they are doing, whether or not they are surviving. And through inventory, we can see species of trees that are doing well or not. And using that information, we have a regularly updated list of trees that we recommend for street tree planting. And we're definitely informed by climate change and all the kind of future challenges we foresee. Pests and pathogen response. Everybody knows that emerald ash borer is in the neighborhood, and knowing what's out there in terms of how much of our forest is vulnerable to that pest has been really helpful in our planning around how we're going to respond to that. And then planning and policy, all those different bureaus who come to you with their reports about 82nd Avenue or street trees 2035. I don't know all the things you hear a lot from the Planning Bureau on how we're going to develop the city in certain areas. Knowing what's out there and knowing the challenges trees currently face really help inform our work there. And I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. That was such a informative presentation. Commissioners, any questions?
Adrian, it's Bruce.
Yes. Okay, great. You're on.
On the map where you had, I think it was dense tree canopy on west side and east side. I wondered if it would be helpful at all to relate the canopy to the population density, comparing west side to east side. There may be areas on the west side where the density actually is quite high, but you do have good canopy. And so that could form an example for what perhaps could happen on the east side if we used good energy. So I'm thinking the data, it could be used to, when people say, oh, it's either trees or housing, you can't have both. You say, well, in this part of Portland, we do have both. So I don't know how the data, if that could be done, but I would think if you went by zip code, put in the population, if there was some way to get population density, it's just a suggestion.
Yeah, there's a lot we can do. If we have a map of canopy, we can overlay it on anything we want, zoning or population density. You're right that population density doesn't mean fewer trees necessarily. I mentioned that New York City has, the same rate of tree canopy cover as we do east of the Willamette River. So I think that tells you that we could be doing better.
The other thing, when people request a permit to remove a street tree, is there a record kept of what was this, what that tree was, what kind of tree it was, so that we know that in 2022 we had 500 street tree removals, and of those 27 were Paul's Scarlet Hawthorn or something like that. I don't know if that kind of data is available, or when they request tree removal, if there's nothing said about what the tree was.
Yeah, they do. We do track the species of tree. Maybe not down to the cultivar or whatever, but yeah, we do track the genus or species of tree that.
Thank you.
is being removed.
I'd like to add to that too, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know in the past few years you've had to dig around in Amanda 7, but that is, as Jeff said, documented. However, the database that we have to use is BDS's database, so it's really not focused on tree data making tree information. So if we want to find out how many of tree X or Y were removed, it takes an awful lot of manual work. Like people have to go into individual files, and we do 10 to 12,000 permit types a year. We are right now starting to put together contracting proposals for a new software system. Finally, since I'm going on year 12 in my role, and from day one we wanted real tree asset management software in the city, and we're finally getting going on that, and that system will be better at this.
Commissioner Jortner?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry
Yeah.
about the background noise. I'll turn this off soon. I think it was a great presentation, and I'm wondering if the city is looking at sort of forecasting the street tree canopy trajectory, because I know in a number of neighborhoods, including mine, there's a lot of very, very large, very old, falling apart trees that are planted in strips that are small enough that they die. The trees that will be planted to replace them will never reach that kind of canopy. That's in many parts of the city. So we can look at where tree canopy can be increased by planting trees in empty street tree spaces, but I'm curious about kind of over time with attrition. I think it would be helpful to forecast how canopy might decline simply because the trees that die off will be replaced with smaller trees because of the planting strip widths and required planting limitations there.
Yeah, that is another question that we do have we do have the data to answer to some extent. Yeah, just like Jen was saying around all of our permit records being owned by the Development Services Bureau, working with the trying to find what the right of way and how much space and what could actually be planted in there. It's actually it's hard information to get from the Bureau of Transportation, but my colleagues in the planting team, they have surveyed thousands and thousands of sites across the city. So in many neighborhoods, we know exactly what the right of way looks like and what is going to come back, what's going to be able to be planted back in. And just like in some of our older parks, I was talking about those even-aged stands and what's going to happen when they fall apart in our older neighborhoods too. It's the same problem that like in Laurelhurst or something where they planted all the trees at the same time and they're beautiful and glorious now, but they are reaching the end of their lives. That's something that is for a few neighborhoods is a real is really going to change their daily experience. In other neighborhoods, we see a pretty good age distribution of trees, so we're not as worried about that.
Just a quick follow-up, there's the even age stand issue, but the issue that I'm particularly asking about is when trees that die, that the planting strip narrowness will not allow the size of trees that are there now to be replanted. So we have large form trees and small planting strips at lots and lots of places that we could forecast how that, just through attrition, that canopy could change over time.
Yeah, and we know what trees are there now, and we know their species, and we know so what their stature, we know how big they are now and how big they would be, and then using that with the right of way.
And we also have a lot of underplanted planting strips as well. So that's something through the regulatory program. If a tree gets removed, they need a removal and replanting permit, and then we require an appropriately sized tree to be replaced. So, there are opportunities as well.
And through the street tree inventory, we looked at, okay, does the tree match the space? It is so much more common for a smaller stature tree to be planted
in a
large space than it is a large stature tree to be in a small space. So that is the challenge we've focused on. Most is trying to get people to maximize those larger spaces. But you're right, in certain neighborhoods, it is, you do have big trees that we aren't gonna be able to plant back again.
And just briefly, so because we could spend hours talking about this, I'll add, Roberta, that to me, the answer there is all about street design and using more progressive materials and designs, and Streets 2035 and the pedestrian design guide update, which we worked on heavily with Bureau of Transportation, are an entree to that. And I know you've heard about trees in the curb zone. Belinda's presented on that in the past. That's kind of a pilot start on one of the many options we have to increase right-of-way space for larger form trees. But it'll take time and it'll take advocacy, commissioners. There's a couple hands up.
Commissioner Vandermark.
Well, Jen, I feel like that was a great segue to my question for Jeff. And Jeff, I don't know if you will know how to answer this, but I'm just thinking about, based on this information, if as a commission, we're really trying to think where to target our time and people resources around advocacy, if you might identify a few items from the data science perspective, it doesn't have to be your perspective, about potential best bang for our advocacy buck, so to speak, based on this information.
Well, we know areas of the forest that are currently not being served. We know that I didn't show you a picture of heat, but everyone's seen pictures of urban heat, and we know that those really line up. So the vulnerabilities that are being experienced in those areas are real. I think everyone's familiar with that. I don't know, maybe I'll defer to Jen. From the data science perspective, there's so much space for planting in all the places that need trees. There's not like, we don't need some new dramatic change to policy in order to get this through. There's just a lot of space for trees, and we need advocacy for and for getting the right trees planted in there and helping people in establishing those trees. And I think something you've heard a lot, one of the lowest hanging fruit is when you have street trees and you have the public responsible for that, you're going to see disparate outcomes. Public with more resources to maintain those trees are going to have more tree canopy, and that's what we've seen, and that's always the first one I'll mention. But if Jen or Brian have any more.
I think Jeff's response is accurate. I, in my role, tend to, for our group and our responsibilities, tend to look at multiple things running at the same time. So along with street tree maintenance policy changing, it is about design, not only on streets, but private property. And the way that really comes about is through projects that are good examples, like 82nd Avenue, 122nd Avenue. Having big tree medians is pretty common in a lot of other cities, including highly, very dense cities like New York City. So if we can get some of those off the ground and all of the other bureaus on board with that, that's the beginning of better things ongoing. And I also think about code amendments. A lot of times things come down to what is the regulation and what prevails. And I'm excited that we will be starting a new code of, and hopefully comprehensive code amendment project within the next few years. Oh, last thing, we now have compliance staff. We're building our first ever compliance team, and an inherent part of having regulations is the ability to enforce them. And so what Jeff was talking about, getting trees planted back as required, and those being the right species, we should be able to do much more in that regard going forward.
Commissioner Plack.
Yeah, just kind of building off what Jen was just saying, I see a big challenge is also the development that we need for housing, but the way that developers tend to build is like a square that takes up the entire lot, which leaves very little space for green anything for the people who live in those high density apartments or condos or whatever they might be. And so I know it seems like this is a big challenge because it's more lucrative for them to build, the most square footage possible on the lot. And we do need the housing, but I think about, at the same time, a lot of our most impacted neighborhoods with development are the ones with the least canopy and less parks access in the neighborhood. So I'm curious, like, what are the levers we can think about to really push for that development to be a courtyard style? So there is a green space there that the neighbors can access. Maybe there's even a play space for children, thinking about like, this is for the communities, like the type of living spaces that people are in, is important. It's not just about housing, but healthy, safe housing as well. So that's one thought, is what are the levers we can be pushing for in terms of how development gets built? Or is that something we don't have a lot of push in, where maybe we focus more on what Dr. Shandus's idea around those micro parks? So thinking about like, where are those little spaces like that the city can then have, put trees in if they're not already there, and kind of have like a mini park that more of the neighbors can access, that for our neighbors who are, in a high heat event, maybe that's even a place that's like a safer place for people to be. So those are just a couple of my thoughts for specifically thinking about North and East Portland, where we know there's, way less trees already. There's more development pressure, I think, in a lot of these neighborhoods also. And we're seeing the development that's going in is just often really leaving no space for large form trees. So what can we do?
I'll say that ever since the new tree code came out, we have been advocating for more flexibility for developers to work around trees, and maybe incentives for preserving trees. And I think that's an ongoing challenge.
Definitely, we could spend a lot of time talking about that and should at some point. Meantime, you'll see I put the link to the Development Review Advisory Committee in the chat, DRAC. That is populated primarily by folks whose profession is property development, even though its stated goals include environment, which includes trees. So some voices there that are talking about the and, housing and not just trees, but environment in general could perhaps be helpful.
And thanks, Megan, for saying, the data science perspective, when we look at where losses are occurring, it's not, development is part of the mix, but if you looked at that map where the purple areas were, those weren't where most of the development has happened in the city. So we are losing canopy outside of the development context a lot. So we got to make sure when we do develop that we're improving those spaces. Like hopefully there's really great spaces on the right of way to build canopy to, that to me, street trees are micro parks. And if we can have continuous canopy down our streets, that is access to nature. That's really important for a lot of Portlanders. So making sure that we get those spaces improved to the max is really important as well.
Commissioner Meisner?
Thank you. I was really interested in your comment about trees, like street trees, where it's common that a street tree is smaller than what the space allows for. Has there been any talk about allowing like removal of small street trees to replace with a larger street tree? For example, like I have across the street, the parking easement is like 8 feet wide with no overhead power lines, but they have trees that are only 20 feet tall and they're not going to grow any bigger because of the species. Is there any allowance or any talk of allowing the removal of smaller trees to allow them like a tree that could grow like 80, 100 feet in those spaces since it allows it?
I think our inspectors, there is a little bit of an oopsie flexibility. If you just planted a tree that was really the wrong one and you really want to plant the right tree, as long as the tree is really small, I think our inspectors have been more flexible in allowing removal and replacement in those situations. But a 20-foot tall tree, it's hard to get any tree to 20 feet. So it is a success. It's unfortunate that that's like as much as you're gonna get, but we're gonna usually we want to preserve the canopy that we have. And then once a tree is established and mature, we do want to preserve it for as long as we can. And then when it gets replaced, hopefully replacing it with the right tree.
Okay, just because, I mean, when I looked at like the tree allowed trees from the city, like that space allows for trees that grow up to like 80 feet. And it just seems a little like kind of like a waste to have a smaller species there. But thank you.
I know we're running out of time. I did have a couple of quick questions. If the answers deserve, future agenda, that would be great. We could defer it. But the couple of questions I had was, are we doing a deep dive into canopy loss, to look at a sort of a random sampling of what's out there, to do a deep dive to understand why, because that seems really critical for going forward and having the right solutions. And then the second thing was, it was very interesting to see, the temporal correlation between the implementation of Title 11 and the loss of canopy. Might just be a coincidence, but is there any, or were there potentially any unanticipated consequences that came from the way Title 11 was written or implemented that we need to correct?
So for the first question, I mentioned that my team's pretty small, so we haven't had the resources to do that deep dive, but luckily with the Urban Forest Management Plan update, I think that is in their scope to try to get at the why and the where of canopy loss. And I don't know, Brian, if you want to add anything to that, but
Yeah, maybe not time to don't have time to spend too much on that right now, but yes, that is something as we're in the process of finalizing the scope of work and get down into what are the specific analyses that we want to see. And that's definitely one of them. And also really getting to your second question as well is looking at how is Title 11 working in that context. There's some limitations to how deep we can get into that. But that is something that we're looking at as well. I mean, Title 11, we know just through the data that we have that there are trees that people would have removed, which they have not through the regulations of Title 11. We also know that there are compliance issues, which is why we're developing a compliance team. We also know there are gaps in Title 11. Title 11 allows for up to 4 trees, up to 20 inches to be removed off of any property. I mean, not a lot of people have trees, that many trees at 20 inches. So there are quite a number of allowances for tree removal, even under the current regulation. So, but yeah, that is something that through this consultant team that we have on board, through the urban forest plan update, that is something we're going to be paying attention to.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we have one more agenda item, and that was the Urban Forestry Commission community agreements, and there's a team that's been working on that. So I turn it over to you. Who will be taking the lead on that, on the intro?
I'll take the lead. This is Daralee. I worked with Roberta and JR to put together a draft of the community agreement. A couple of things. These are just to get a launching pad to get us started on this conversation. So we do envision this might be a little bit tighter with less points maybe potentially at the end of this process, but we wanted to keep everything that we discussed to give you a variety of things to think about. So we do envision that these will be kind of living points that will guide us through our time serving on the board, and that we will start our meetings potentially going over and reading some of the community agreement guidelines. We also have some commissioner duties at the bottom for discussion as well. JR, Roberta, anything to add?
Just to emphasize that this is a start of the conversation. We're looking for input. We're looking for, I don't think we're going to officially adopt them today, but between now and when we do officially adopt them, feel free if folks have additional thoughts or want to inquire. What does this actually mean? How does it look in practice? We thought that these community agreements best reflected the values and would probably help us at least have conversation, dialogue, and debate in a civil way. Thank you.
Any thoughts from Commissioner on the scope, the detail, everything? Any feedback? Well, I'll kick it off. I generally liked the themes, and I probably got to what I was interested in seeing. If we're going to read it every time, we might want to have a short bulletized version and then the detail in a different place. But I thought it was really, really great first draft.
Chair Feldstein, Bruce.
Yes, go for it.
I had a question. I don't actually know what fiduciary means. I think of it as meaning something to do with finances, but maybe I'm wrong. So on the commissioner duties, the fourth bullet down, we have a fiduciary duty. I'm just not sure exactly what that means. I didn't look up fiduciary, but I keep thinking has something to do with finances.
I'll take that one because likely I recommended it. It kind of sounds like a very legally term, and it is. It's just really as part of a commission or board, and this is true for any commission or board you may serve on. We have specific duties to carry out the charge, and it's basically your loyalties to your duties and to the board, and to put the needs of the board and the commission before our own personal interests. And so, you know, when we mention this point, it's really, sometimes we may feel very strongly about a topic, and we may, you know, really want to drive discussions and get our viewpoint across, which we definitely should, but we have to balance that interest with the interest of the commission and the needs of the commission to also complete, like if there's decisions that need to be made by a certain time frame, or other duties we need to carry out, or other business we need to take care of, that we prioritize the needs of the commission and the work.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I had a request for a clarification too, with that notation of respectfully call in each other and share the responsibility of adhering to these guidelines. So I'm not sure I understand the intent of the call-in aspect there.
No, I can speak to that. In a lot of organizations, we want to, or conversations, it's always hard to quote unquote call out somebody and be like, you're out of line, you're out of order, or that doesn't fall into, you know, that's a violation of our guidelines or something. And it's always othering and very aggressive. We want to take the values in of calling in somebody, instead of trying to out somebody and make them feel like they did something wrong. I'm taking the responsibility to bring them in and help them and teach them, whether it's like in the moment or following up afterwards. Like, I want to make sure, you know, I didn't mean to out you, but I wanted to make sure that we're in our guidelines, and just sort of making it a teachable moment and encourage conversation and dialogue, as well as, and that's on one end, but on the other end of when somebody does bring something to you, you're agreeing to, like, I'm agreeing to a process. Somebody can call me in, and that when somebody does call me in, that I'm going to listen and have the intent to have a follow-up conversation. Why and what is it that I can learn and help be better for the next conversation.
Commissioner Iliacho.
Thanks. A couple things. Who should we send our suggested edits to? Especially if it's like a formatting or grammatical. I just want to know who, if it's all three of you all, cool, but if it's just one person.
If you could send it to all three of us, we would appreciate it. We've been working as a team.
All right, awesome. And then my next question was for bullet 1 under the guidelines. Could you elaborate more of what you mean there? I see that you put a definition of positive intent, but could you elaborate on the statement itself? Assume positive intent when people comment. Yeah, what was the thought process there? Because that stuck out to me as interesting and not necessarily intuitive, depending on the context of when people are meeting.
I'll take that one. I think it's a reminder that I think sometimes when we're having heated debates, especially, I'll kind of use that as an example. Sometimes people express their opinion and maybe they don't agree. Like maybe, let's say I just expressed an opinion and somebody responds and their opinion is different than mine or whatever. Sometimes we can take it really personally and we can feel like, oh, they're attacking me, or they're you know, they're not hearing my point of view, and sometimes it puts us into a defensive mode. And I think it's just a reminder to step back and say, they are expressing themselves in a positive way, although they may feel completely differently than me. It's not about me. They are trying to make sure that this is a productive discussion and all these other viewpoints. It's just a grounding reminder that when people are commenting, that they're coming from a positive. We all have the same goal of trying to have a robust discussion and come to a consensus. And so it's just kind of a grounding reminder that other people want to share their point of view for discussion, for consideration, to achieve the best overall objective for the commission and whatever work we're doing.
Thank you. That makes sense. I do have some suggestions on maybe rewording it, because the way you described it just now makes complete sense without asking the reader to kind of make assumptions in order to follow along. So yeah, I'll follow up with that with you all later. And then my last, oh, go ahead.
Thank you.
Okay. And then my last comment or question is, would we as a commission be interested in linking, maybe providing links to videos that kind of model some of the behaviors that we're alluding to, just again, to get people on the same page and also give folks an idea of like what it looks like to embody these guidelines?
I think that's a great idea. And it may be that as people roll on to the commission, you know, we can share some of those materials with them kind of at the outset to help frame kind of, this is our community agreement and this is how we embody this. Because I think this is also kind of a newer concept to a lot of folks. I've seen this on boards that I participate in, but it's something I've only seen more recently. So especially if folks have been out of the mix for a while and they're new to board service in general, it might be a great learning opportunity and training.
Thank you.
And I'll also add to that, there was greatly shared, that we're not expecting day one everyone to fully embody, memorize, and act this way. This is going to be a starting point, you know, guidelines of, we'll have to learn all this together as we're engaging in conversation, and some of us may make mistakes, and that's okay. I think the guidelines kind of leave room for like learning and understanding, as well as it being a living document of maybe this, we had some good intention about this guideline, but in practice it didn't work out with some of the personalities in the room, so there's room for adjustment. And I think that's totally fine. I think it gives a starting point of how we all show up prepared for the conversation.
Commissioner Vandermark.
JR just spoke to some of the things I was going to say. So great points, JR. From a nonprofit perspective, and I've worked for many nonprofits, it's very common to have community agreements, and to JR's point, to have it evolve, you know, you have new folks and later you're like, that actually doesn't resonate anymore. So I feel like that is just I don't know if we want to capture that in here, but recognizing that like maybe it is an evolving document. But the comment I just wanted to make, maybe aside from the commissioner duties, I like that, but even if it takes time, I have found in application of community agreements that reading them is every time is a very grounding activity. It reminds me of all of these things. It's very easy if you just write them and you don't revisit them to just not try to embody them. So I would encourage us to find a way. I was maybe saying we don't read the commissioner duties out loud, but maybe if you all feel important, I don't want to take it off the table, but I think if we can find a way to do this and get into a rhythm of it, it might help with the application of the agreements. So in essence, just agreeing with that call for us to do that.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I had a question actually for the group working on this. So one thing that I like is the comment to actively disrupt abusive, threatening, or discriminatory language or behavior, but thought that we need an agreement on how that should be done. And it does relate to Commissioner Lilly's concept of, the calling in. I hadn't heard that before. So, how do you suggest we actually do that?
I think right now, the model is that we have a chair who is the presiding officer over the meeting, and has the authority to stop conversation and I don't know if for lack of a better term, be a referee in the room, or if somebody, if a commissioner during the meeting, or a community member, somebody is disruptive, somebody can voice it and the chair has the authority to take action, whether it's to ask the person to pause or ask someone to step out of the meeting. There's probably, like, for extreme disruptive behavior, there's probably some city protocol that we can lean on. But I think it's sort of the intention with the guidelines is that we're agreeing to come into a space where if I'm being disruptive, somebody can take action on that, and that there's whatever actions deems appropriate, whether with city guidelines or just what the chair deems at the moment, just sort of like we're coming in, like if I'm being disruptive, that I can be like dismissed from the meeting.
Yeah, I think that's good. I'm wondering, as you talked about that, if something like, for all of us to feel free to voice, I'm feeling uncomfortable with the tone or the content, or the way something's being said. Can you reframe that? Putting it in the positive, maybe a way for us to sort of agree to interact.
Yeah, that's some good feedback. I think maybe adding some more language to that phrase or more clarification might bring that intent a little bit forward more. Yeah. So open to more suggestions. We'll take a look at that as well.
Any other thoughts or comments from the commissioners on this?
It's like Commissioner Black has her hand raised.
Oh, okay, thank you. You have a white background, so it's hard for me to see your hand. Commissioner Black.
Yeah, and just building off of that, I think what is disruptive can sometimes be subjective too, because when issues really impact people and communities, it's really like there's a lot of emotion and a lot of feeling in that. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, these are people's lives, right? Like that are being impacted by decisions that are made that we're advising on. So it is a really charged, can be a really charged situation. And what might feel threatening or disruptive, it, I think can be subjective depending on the identities of the people that we're talking about and the situation and the issues that are being brought up. So I'm kind of interested in thinking about how we define what's disruptive, because some things need to be disrupted, and I don't see that as always a negative. I think it's a real challenge working in government or any kind of large organization or bureaucracy to push on systems that need to be pushed, right? And so that's part of what we're here to do. So that's just something, I don't know that there's like an answer of this is the list of things that we say are disruptive. I don't know, that's not what I'm suggesting, but just maybe keeping that conversation going about how we define disruption. And it, you know, sometimes, like, again, there are things that need to be disrupted or pushed on, and we should try to find ways to do that we can still function and work together, but that those conversations can happen.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Flack. I completely agree. And I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I think we might learn from example as well, but I do think, at least in my mind, to kind of, for something to think about, I think we as a group should think about how we want to approach disruption or address these types of issues. I agree it's very subjective, and I think we have to be really careful about encroaching on different communication styles from folks from different communities and different backgrounds. And what I view as being something that we should really focus on is more of personal attacks, like in terms of comments about individuals' race, gender identity, things like that, that are completely what I would call out of pocket, that just have no place in this type of discussion. That we can hopefully create like a short list of what we all agree is like, there's usually no legitimate purpose for that type of behavior, or something that we all view as like commonly abusive and disruptive to this process. But I think it should be a fairly short and tight list, and I don't think it's something that should be like, you know, subtle and nuanced and like, oh, I feel like if the volume is raised, some people are really passionate and speak in a louder voice. And so I do think some of those things probably aren't appropriate for the list, but I do think there are some things, you know, having worked at the city and attended a lot of public meetings, sometimes things go off the rails in a really unproductive way. And I'm more focused on that type of behavior where somebody's coming not to legitimately talk about an agenda item, but maybe to be genuinely disruptive or to attack others. That's more of what I view as being kind of the nexus of the discussion versus just like things that are a little bit too nuanced. So I would hope to focus our attention on more of the type of genuinely disruptive, not good for discussions, personal attack type stuff versus kind of subtle communication style differences. Maybe not so subtle too, quite frankly, but I completely agree. These can be really heated topics. These impact people's lives. And so to the extent that somebody expresses themselves passionately or in a way that we might not find comfortable, I think we have to live with a certain level of discomfort as folks that serve the community.
Okay, City Forester Cairo, or I didn't see who was first. I see that Commissioner Lilly, you have your hand up, and also
Go ahead.
I'm fine with you going, Jar, if you'd like.
Okay.
Commissioner Lilly.
Cool. Just to add to this, I think just a reminder, these guidelines are in tune with our values, and our values that we hold of equity and being trauma informed, and some of these other values are also incorporated in there. So we want to definitely have that lens when we are engaging in these guidelines. And also the guidelines is more or less, or our community agreement is kind of like how we're a starting point for us. There is also a separate like governance for Oregon public meeting laws, as well as the city of Portland, like no tolerance for hate and different elements of that if it does, there's some governance that the city takes, implements in our meetings that like if it does reach a certain way that they, the city has the right to kind of intervene in such a way. But at least for us, this is a starting point where we'll start the conversation.
Commissioner Meissner?
First, I want to thank everyone and thank the group for putting this together. I know it's been taking a long time. I just want to say that, like, I agree with everything on the list. Personally, I don't know. I feel like some of this feels a little performative. Just because, like, I would agree that this represents our values. But I mean, like, I've emailed you all before about I felt like I've been targeted. I've seen videos of commissioners talking about me behind my back, and like there's never been a resolution to that. And so it just feels that this is just like slapping a band-aid on to make it look like we're improving, but I don't know, just it doesn't feel very substantive is what I would say.
Just one quick comment. I'm wondering actually if we could have something about that. I think that's a really good comment, Justin. We shouldn't feel like we're talking behind each other's backs if we're, following up on this calling in kind of process, right? So to have some agreement about requesting, a discussion if something's an issue outside of meeting time or what have you. So in other words, to directly discuss any issue, important issue. Okay. Well, maybe the group can think about that. Okay, I know. So we have Jen Cairo has been waiting patiently. So why don't we have you go first? And then I see Darrell.
Thank you, Chair. I was going back to Darrell and then actually better what Commissioner Lilly was saying about the city has certain guidance and structures in place. And I wanted to remind you all about the training last time that we had about respectful workplace, that Human Resources Administrative Rule 2.02. And this goes back to what Commissioner Bechtold was saying about maybe developing a list of like egregiously unacceptable type of things that there would be action on. That policy is an expectation of the city for all employees and volunteers, as you know from the training, and it has a list in it. So rather than the commission creating its own list, you just offering this up kind of as a reminder, you might want to consider instead linking to that since it's an expectation already. Thanks.
Thank you. That's an awesome suggestion. And we need reminders like that, I think, to pull it all together sometimes. To Commissioner Meissner's point, what they spoke about really resonated with me in terms of kind of like restorative justice. And I feel like, or what I'm hearing is that they don't really feel settled, or they don't really feel like that issue is properly addressed. And it may be that as part of this process, we develop guidelines for resolution of some of those types of issues. And because this is intended to be a living document, it may evolve over time, but there may be, a way that we all kind of say when things like this come up that really impact kind of our personal service on the commission or in our relationship to each other, in order to mitigate kind of negative feelings or address toxicity or any type of issues in which we feel we're not being respected in the way that we would like. I think we can come up with a way of how we feel like we can restore the balance and have our issues addressed, versus having this linger. Because I think, at least for the small work group, we really felt like this was something that, it's not performative. It's something that we really want to do. And I think we're just at the beginning of that process. So I think we can loop back around once we kind of develop these guidelines more and have an opportunity to address some of those issues that Commissioner Meisner brought up and hopefully bring it to a resolution.
Thank you. We're pretty much at time, but quickly.
Well, and my question, I know that, and it's hard when we're talking about emails versus public conversation, and I don't really know how to handle all that within meeting law, so I'm just gonna let that go for a minute. Is I know that questions were asked within that context about like, what is the process and procedures currently in place for that? And I feel like last month's meeting did not resolve that, if I'm being honest. I don't feel like that really got addressed. And I know that within this context, it was talked about it, issues being raised to appropriate city staff. I will always add the layer that it could be the city staff person that is the challenge, right? No offense to anyone in the room, but just recognizing that. So I think getting a better understanding of what that actually means, right? Like, what does it mean? And is what the current process is and the procedures in place once we have clarity, I think it's important to have a conversation about whether for our commission, that's in fact what we would want the policies and procedures to be, right? So I think it's kind of hard to address something that feels a little in a vacuum of what the practices are. I don't have a deep understanding, and that didn't really come out of the presentation for me.
Great. Well, it sounds like this is all a work in progress, including, getting some, there was some good chat on getting some clarification on meeting rules, follow up and so forth, as well as, the need to come up with the next draft from our work group based on the feedback. And I just wanted to thank everyone for their great effort today. It was a great meeting, and thank you again to the group who's working on the community agreements. And I think the plan is to bring it back next month again, correct? With revisions. Good.
Later, Brian.
Yeah, depending on timing.
Sorry,
Yes.
Chair, I was just conferring with Brian, depending
Yes.
on timing. We
Okay,
have
if
a couple
it's fine.
items scheduled, so, we'll figure that out
Okay,
with you.
either that or the following month. Great. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Thanks for staying 5 minutes over, and we'll see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.